Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, my fine friends. Welcome to the 13th episode of Season 3 of the Tom Petty Project podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Brown. This is the podcast that digs into the entire Tom Petty catalogue, song by song, album by album, and includes conversations with musicians, fans, and people connected with Tom along the way. Today's episode is a wrap-up overview of Damn the Torpedoes as a whole, and I'm joined for the first time by, not a guest, but a co-host, John Paulsen. John's another diehard Tom Petty fan and is also the creator of the 4for4 fantasy football website and is one of the hosts of the Most Accurate podcast, which discusses and analyzes the world of fantasy football throughout the year. John reached out to me and asked if I'd be interested in having him on the podcast to do an album wrap-up episode whenever his schedule allows, and I figured it would be a lot of fun, so here we are. So welcome to the show, John.
Oh, thanks for having me, Kevin. I just want to say thanks for tackling this project. I mean, I've been thinking about doing a Tom Petty album-centric podcast for years now, and it's just I hadn't got the format down or the time down to do it. And so I reached out to you and just suggested this idea because I think the podcasting world is sort of lacking in Tom Petty content. I think he's deserving of a lot more than what he's recognition that he's been getting, at least in the podcasting world. So this is a great format. I really enjoy your song by song analysis, and thanks again for tackling this project.
So you said your time has been a little bit cramped, and that's obviously because you've got a very busy schedule with fantasy football. So tell me a little bit about that, because I'm curious. I've sort of dabbled my toes into the waters of fantasy sport, but never really sort of plunged in full. So give me some background on that.
Yeah, I sort of joined the industry back in 2000. I won a rankings accuracy contest and ended up at 4for4 a couple of years later, and it's been a full-time job since then. It's been a lot of fun. I've sort of found my niche in this industry after being an industrial engineer for several years. That's why I was in Memphis for several years after college, and I moved out here to California. And that's sort of, I have a feeling of kinship with Tom Petty, in that he, grew up in the South. I grew up in Wisconsin, but we both headed out to California and was kind of amazed by the state and kind of fell in love with the state. So as far as fantasy goes, I've been doing this podcast for 10 years. If you want to check it out, it's great. But, I'm here to talk Tom Petty today.
Perfect. Let's do that then. So what do you remember your first sort of experience of hearing Tom Petty, or the first time it became more than just another band or another artist that you listened to, and it became, oh, actually now I'm a Tom Petty fan? Do you remember that sort of evolution?
Yeah, it was definitely Full Moon Fever. When you hear the stories about people hearing Full Moon Fever for the first time and falling in love with him there. That was what it was for me. I was aware of him in the hits prior to that. But then you see the video for Free Falling and I Won't Back Down, and you start to fall in love with these songs on the radio. I bought that album, much like Rick Rubin did, and played it over and over and over again. I think I was 16 at that time. And I think at that point, it was a front to back album for me. So I would listen to the whole thing. I don't think there's a bad song on the album, although Tom said in the past he didn't know how Zombie Zoo ended up on the track list, but that's another podcast. I went back then at that point and I bought the live album, Pack Up the Plantation, just because, funds were a little limited. I didn't have time or the money to dig into all of his past discography, or his all the albums of the past. And that one had a lot of hits on it that I had recognized. And then I started digging. I think Damn the Torpedoes was probably the third Petty album that I owned.
And so what did you think of that album when the first time you heard it? So obviously you would have been aware of Refugee, Here Comes My Girl, some of those tracks you would know. But when you sort of dig into some of those deeper cuts, did they just jump off the page for you the same way they did for me?
Yeah, for me, Don't Do Me Like That is the banger on that album. And the fact that that was, on side 2 was interesting to me. I thought the first 3 tracks were just amazing, one after another. Really, if you want to get into early Petty, this is a good one to just put on, because those first 3 tracks are so strong. And then he gives you a picture in that rest of that album of his songwriting. And maybe some of the tracks aren't as popular, but they're really well written. There's some great moments in all of them. For me, I just kept going with Full Moon Fever, then into The Great Wide Open, and you start getting into some of his later stuff. That was that Wildflowers, obviously. That was the era for me that turned me into a huge Tom Petty fan. But it's always been fun to go back to these early albums, put them on, listen to them, and maybe you notice some things you didn't notice the first 40 times you listened to them.
Well, it's funny you say that too. So like you always have a different relationship with an artist's music once you're a fan, and then once they start releasing albums, then with the music they released before you became a fan, right? Because there's a different connection to it. When an album drops and you go rush out and buy the album, you put it on, you listen to that album for the first time before any of those songs have really been played or heard before. There's just something really, really different about that. It's the same thing I had that with Foo Fighters. I got into Foo Fighters really late, and then I think the first album they released after I'd sort of become a fan was Wasting Light, and that's my favorite Foo Fighters album because it was the first one I got really hyped about hearing for the first time and sort of bringing home. And so I think, and I didn't get that with Tom because I got into him way too late to actually have that experience. But man, listening to Wildflowers for the first time, that must just been an absolutely mind-blowing kind of experience.
Yeah, and that album was a kind of a departure for him. So you're sort of, you're used to this sunny pop, California pop rock, but classic pop type, just catchy songs on Full Moon Fever and Into the Great Wide Open. And then that was a little, I wouldn't say darker, but it was more introspective and more personal. And, Wildflowers is the track is amazing. And, the first half of that album just grabs you. And then I think the second half of that album is, you're digging in, and it takes a few more listens for you to get into some things. I mean, Honeybee for me was an immediate song. I mean, I really liked that. And that was a concert favorite. But, I think Wildflower, like you look at what he did in his mid 30s to mid 40s, when most artists are either packing it up or just doing a nostalgia tour, and the songwriting that he did in that span was just, incredible with the Wilburys and his solo stuff, and then and everything else. So just a tremendous songwriter, and one of my favorites of all time.
When you talk about that, I've talked about that with other people on the podcast too, about even the last three albums. When you hit Hypnotic Eye, now he's in his 50s, late 50s. We're starting to get into sort of the twilight, typically, of a rocker's career, where most guys are really winding down. Like you said, now we're into the greatest hits tour, or we're doing the third or fourth comeback tour like Kiss. Tom Petty's and the Heartbreakers they're in the ascendancy. They're still writing songs that are challenging. They're challenging their own sort of sound. They're challenging their own direction, but they're still rock and roll songs. They still sound like the Heartbreakers. So to me, that's always been fascinating. That there was still clearly a lot more output there than just those last few. Obviously, we never got those, but there would have been more to come, I think.
I think from a live standpoint, I've seen a lot of bands of his generation live, and I think the way that I judge them is, when there's a new song, how does that hold up with the rest of their hits? And all the way through his career, he was still writing bangers. I call them bangers. They're just tracks that really work, and they work within the set lists that he would put together. And they wouldn't be ones where, you hear it and you're like, I'm going to go get a beer or whatever. Like they're ones like, I wanted to hear Saving Grace. I wanted to hear that live. So I think that's one way to judge that generation is to see how many people are walking to the seats, or heading for the aisles, trying to get a drink at the counter when the new tracks are coming on, because that really, when you can write songs that hold up, in your 50s, 60s, sure, that's pretty incredible.
And even some of those songs are not necessarily singles. Some of those live songs that he put in the set, especially from those later albums like Fault Lines, that's not a single, but no one's leaving their seat when that comes on, right?
Yeah, or like Square One. That's one of the, my favorite songs he's ever written, and that's came off a later album, and just an incredible track.
Well, it's funny too, though. It's like you said, that it kind of lines up with what Jimmy Iovine said when they were sequencing the track list, and you said, those first three tracks are just it's unbelievable that's all written in the same span, and then two of them were on the same tape that Mike Campbell sent to Tom. I mean, that's ridiculous on its face. But Jimmy Iovine said, I want to hear the singles up top, because and I commented on this. The first two albums, I find the sequencing on those ones a little bit odd, and I know that the sleeve of the first record was a problem, and that caused them. People thought they were a punk band and all this kind of stuff. But I also think when you're coming out with that lead track, "Rocking Around with You," it's not the strongest track off the album, and if you're dropping the needle on an album for the first time, you probably should lead with something that's going to grab you and hold you, right? So I totally get where Iovane's coming from. And again, I think the sequencing on Down the Torpedoes is phenomenal. Maybe we'll get into it. But so let's talk about the record. Let's talk about the
Okay, sounds good.
So Refugee, give me your thoughts on Refugee.
Refugee is obviously a great track. It's not my favorite on the album, but I think that comes from hearing it so often in concert. Now, I know you didn't get a chance to see Tom live. I was trying to put a list together of all the times I've seen him and the Heartbreakers live, and I got to 10, and I think it's more, but I can't place all the different guys. So I was really fortunate that I was able to see him so many times. But the Refugee was always one that you knew was going to get played. And I think for my, when I'm at concerts, I want to hear certain songs, and there's certain, and I know we're going to hear Refugee. It's going to take up a spot in the set list, and the crowd's going to love it, and it's going to be a good time. But I heard it every single time. So I think for me, it wasn't like overplayed or anything like that. But with respect to this album, it's probably my fourth favorite song on the album. But obviously, if you look at it from a construction standpoint, or if you just took it in a vacuum and this is the first time you're hearing the song, it's an amazing song. I mean, the performance on it's phenomenal. The music's great. His vocal performance is great. And it's a great one to open the album.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I'm the same way with sort of Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen or Stairway to Heaven by... I don't need to listen to those songs anymore because they're so seared onto my synapses because I've heard them so often that... And it doesn't mean that I don't love them, but I don't really need to hear those anymore. It's the deep cuts that generally tend to grab you, which maybe is a little unfair because, like you said, that riff, just right out the gate, that opening riff, just blows you away. Mike Campbell's guitar on that song is just tremendous, all the way through, and Tom's vocal as well, right? I mean, I really struggle singing that song. It's right at the end of my range. I can just about do it some days especially if I've had a couple of beers and I'm a little bit looser. I can just about hit it, but otherwise, it's a tough one to sing. Yeah,
and I think he was talking about the challenges of singing it. Like it took him a while to figure it out, and that was one where I think Benmont said in one of the interviews, Mike Campbell said it, 150 takes at least of Refugee are out there trying to get it right, because they were trying to do everything live in the studio, so they were trying, and that had to be a big challenge with that song because that's pretty intricate.
Absolutely, yeah. And you think about sort of, I think later in his career, Tom didn't actually tune down a lot of his songs. From watching you've watched the stuff from 83, 81, 82, 83, and then from sort of 2015, 16, even the 40th anniversary tour, most of the songs he's singing in the original key, but I think that one might be one that you'd have to sort of say, well, let's just step that down half a step or a full step. That's fine. No one's going to notice,
Yeah, you go from singing that in your 20s to singing that in your 70s. That's a big challenge.
Yeah, not all artists do that, right? There's no shame in doing that. So, okay, what about Here Comes My Girl?
Phenomenal track. That's just one, especially with the way he's sort of speaking over the opening and all that really grabs you as a person who's aware of the song, but you're listening to it maybe the first time within the context of Refugee, but after Refugee and before even the Losers, and just how great of a track it is. And the "Oh Shelley, Here Comes My Girl," whatever he's saying there is just an incredible moment, I think, in the album.
Well, I like there's the little bit before they go to the bridge, and it's just one that says "Watch Her Walk," and it's a throwaway line. It doesn't really sort of, but I think without that line leading into that bridge, you lose a little bit of the mystique, maybe, or sort of the charisma of the song. And it's absolutely one of my favorites. It's one that I always go back to, and again, it's one of those that I've heard a million times, but I can hear a million more because it's so good. And it's nice that they do drop that sort of tempo off a little bit from Refugee. The Refugee comes out the gate like a horse that's bolted.
Mm-hmm.
Here Comes My Girl. Okay, now we're not just sort of putting out, this is not just going to be 10 straight ahead rock and roll songs. We've got a little bit of a change of gears here before, obviously, the rest of the side one is, again, pretty much straight ahead rock and roll. So I kind of like that sort of that switch up early on in that on that side of the album.
Yeah, I think I noticed it after watching Somewhere Under Heaven, the documentary about Wildflowers.
Somewhere You Feel Free.
The making of Somewhere You Feel Free. Sorry about that. Somewhere You Feel Free on YouTube. I believe it was on YouTube. But talking about sequencing and how important sequencing was to him. So then I went back to listen to Wildflowers again, and you just notice it goes from maybe fast acoustic to slower, mid-tempo rocker.
Yeah.
And then, he's changing it up constantly. You don't have the same type of songs one after another. And I think, when you go back and listen to these albums now within that context, it's pretty impressive, and how much thought he put into the sequencing. I'm sure Jimmy Iovine had a lot to do with that as well, but he wasn't stacking the same type song over and over again to where it got kind of mundane.
And I think that some of that I think some of that is one of the things that Tom was absolutely brilliant at was learning from other people, and whether that's sort of taking from his influences as musicians or listening to his bandmates or his producers, the sequencing of his albums definitely changed. Like I said, I think the first two albums were sequenced a little bit weirdly to me. I would definitely sequence those albums differently. Layperson from Saskatoon who's never released an album, but I think from then on, they definitely took more care over that. And those three, what I call the Iovine Trilogy, and I know that, again, Southern Accents is definitely Southern Comfort. Southern Accents is an Iovine album, but it kind of is, it kind of isn't to me. But those three, all three of them, the sequencing on those albums is just immaculate. You wouldn't change one song out of order, or I wouldn't anyway.
Yeah, and you're talking about how much he learned probably in that span, like going from the first album where I believe they put American Girl as the last track on that album, and if you have a band and you're trying to break out or break into the industry,
yes,
I would think that would be first.
You would think so.
Maybe you start with American Girl and then go breakdown after that, and you're like, oh, this is a band to pay attention to, as opposed to burying it on the last track. But and then you get into the third album, and I think all of those issues are sort of sorted out.
Yeah, and just having that steady hand, someone who's sort of because I mean the first album, from what I've read, Denny Cordell produced, but they were kind of left to their own devices with Noah Shark and more or less with the engineers, and sort of figure that out yourselves. And Denny would come in and say, well, maybe redo this, but he wasn't sort of hands-on like Jimmy Iovine was. And obviously that definitely created tension especially with Stan, when you've got someone who's really hands-on now and is going to tell you, well, no, that's crap. You need to do that again. That doesn't sound right. We need to, So I think, again, that experience of learning studio craft is totally different from stagecraft, right? A great live band is one thing. A great studio band is another. There are fewer of them that are brilliant at both. And I think that learning curve, like I said, going into those the Iovine sort of albums, that's where they sort of came out. Okay, well, now we know exactly what we're doing. Now we know how to make records now. We've always been able to play songs, but now we know how to make records.
Yeah, and I think that you talked about Tom learning from other people. I think was just a brilliant man, and was always aware of his own shortcomings, and was able to work on his faults, like anybody that's really trying to get really good at their craft. He's so determined to do that. So he's not going to just poo-poo an idea because he didn't think of it. So so that's just another thing that made him so great.
Well, again, I talked about that with Paul Zolo, or maybe John Scott. We were talking about that. Most young men in their teens and their early 20s, they're getting into rock and roll for different reasons, and maybe it's the party and maybe it's the girls, and I'm sure that that's going to play in. But right early on, you could tell that Tom and Mike, especially, and Ben Mont, were very focused on, well, the music's got to be good first. Everything else we'll deal with later. And there was the no girls on the bus rule, which is probably pretty unusual for a young rock band touring the country back then. So that real focus on getting the craft right. So that's exactly what you're saying, right? So we need to make sure that we're writing the best songs we can write. Every single take is the best take we can do, and then we build out from there. And that's how we actually get good, is getting that stuff right first, getting the foundations right. So totally agree. So what about Even the Losers, track 3?
Even the Losers, another concert favorite. Always really happy to hear this one come on. The crowd would go crazy. Just the nostalgia, I think, in the lyrics. It just hits you right from the start. Well, it was an early summer. We sat on your roof, smoked cigarettes, and stared at the moon.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just such a good opener. And then the story behind it, and the chorus where he didn't know it, and when they decided they were going to record, and he was like, "Oh yeah, let's do a take." Didn't have the chorus, and he says it was like lightning hit him, and maybe one of the best choruses he's written.
Yeah,
but he didn't even have time to think of it. It just came to him, which is pretty cool.
Can you imagine? Like, that blows me away. Like, I mean, going in with nothing and coming out with something most people can do. And I know that, excuse me, sorry. I'm a big Genesis fan too. And Phil Collins, the way they wrote was they'd all sit in the studio and they'd write the music together. And Phil Collins would just sort of scat over top. He'd just mumble nonsense sort of melody lines, and they'd try to pick out things. But to go up to the mic with literally nothing and then that to come out, dear God, I mean, that's just a different level of talent.
Yeah, that's what sort of leads me to believe that this album and this track were meant to be. I like to hear the story. Like he's like trying to explain the Even Losers Get Lucky Sometimes, and how he was constantly hitting on this one girl and trying to be your boyfriend or just get together or whatever. And finally she sort of relented and she said, this isn't going to happen long term, but for tonight it's okay. I think that's just a great story behind that lyric.
And you said that it was sort of obviously a live staple. Was that one of those songs? I imagine it was as soon as that kicks off, I'm sure the crowd just surges, right? It's one of those that everyone gets up straight away.
Yes, I think his fan base really, anytime Here Comes My Girl, Even Losers, were played, big concert favorites, because they were just the classics that everybody loved that got them into him. And it wasn't something you were expecting to hear in every show. I think maybe, after this album came out, yes, you're going to hear it in every single show. But when I was seeing him in the 90s and the aughts mainly, it was, here and there you get one or the other, but you wouldn't get both, or maybe you did get both. It was incredible. So it was one of those little treats, because he had such a deep catalog that he could put together a 20-25 song playlist and leave out a few hits.
I always think about that. Tom Petty, Springsteen, Dylan, John. How do you put together a 20? No wonder their concerts were so long, right? Because what the hell do you drop? What don't you play? And again, you've got the stuff they have to play, really. There's, or like you said, I mean, they didn't always play Refugee. They didn't always play. I think American Girl might be the one that's the one that you kind of have to put in the show. But that's one of the things I've always admired about Tom, is they did put in, they'll put in something from, Let Me Up, I've Had Enough, or they'll throw some, they'll do Jamming Me, where they hadn't done it for 20 years, but they'll go back to it. So I kind of really appreciate that. But some of those songs, I remember listening to an interview with a rock band called Clutch. I don't know if you're familiar with Clutch.
Yeah. Yep.
So Neil Fallon was saying that they were supporting Motorhead way back in their early days. And there was one show where they didn't play Electric Worry. And they came off stage and Lemmy said to them, why the hell didn't you play Electric Worry? He said, oh, well, we sort of change it up every night and we like to do different things. He said, dude, that's your Ace of Spades. That's the one song that people have come to hear you play. And I think sort of there are some of those songs. American Girl might be the one that you sort of have to play. But there's some of those other ones, Here Comes My Girl, Even the Losers, Refugee, as long as you're getting one of them, maybe two of them, then I think you're doing fine, right?
Yeah, I mean, American Girl was always played. Refugee was almost always played. And I think in all the concerts that I saw, he played it. So it was a 95%, 99% type, made the set list. Maybe there was a tour where they were a little sick of playing it. But when I looked up setlist.fm, just kind of look at his historical track listings, that was Refugee was the second most played after American Girl. But American Girl was definitely knew you were going to hear that. Yeah,
for sure. And it's always funny looking through that when you go to the artist statistics, because obviously it's something that I go back to for each episode to see how often tracks were played. And some of the tracks that were never played live are really surprising. You think, wow, that's because you think like, what are you doing in my life? You would think, you talk about bangers, talk about stadium rock songs. Holy crap. I mean, that would just get the place absolutely hopping, but very, very rarely played. So you sort of think about, okay, well, maybe he's picking, okay, if I'm going to do two, three songs from Damn the Torpedoes, don't know whether I can really sacrifice one of the others to put that in the set list, but obviously I occasionally did. But
I was just going to say that it's a, how do you take that and leave Here Comes My Girl off, or Even Losers off, or Don't Do Me Like That off? Like that's the choice. That's like a Sophie's Choice that he's probably got. He wants to play it maybe, but he also was really big about his fans having a great experience and going to see Tom Petty in the Heartbreakers and not leaving disappointed. So he would, like a lot of bands, like they would really ramp the energy of their set up to the end, and they would they close the main set with two or three really great songs, and then the encore would be amazing, and then he wouldn't leave out the ones that you're expecting to hear, like the ones you have to hear. So that was big for him, I think, and big for his fans.
Okay, let's move on to track 4, Shadow of a Doubt, A Complex Kid.
Yeah, this is one that, I would just say that this is one that has sort of grown on me as time has gone on. And I think I've listened to this album quite a few times. As I was in the 90s and the aughts and listening to old Petty, it was typically throw on the Greatest Hits album, the really outstanding Greatest Hits album. But then every once in a while you go back to Damn the Torpedoes, and this is one that, it's following 3 really good songs, but it holds up pretty well. Like, it's not my favorite, but it's a good solid song.
Yeah, it's one of the ones that I sort of, I don't have on my massive Petty playlist for when I'm going out doing my long distance running, whatever it might be. I don't have it on there, and it's not that, again, not that I don't like it, but there's other songs that I definitely am going to listen to first. But as you said, and there's another song on this album that when we get to it is the same thing. It's a sleeper where when you do hear it again, you're like, oh, actually, yeah, I quite like that song. That's a good song. Now, I rated this one a 7 out of 10 because, again, when you stack it up against everything else on side one, to me, it's back of that a little bit, right? But it's not like, again, it's not a bad song. And I've gone into this whole project really with the idea that I don't think that I'm going to be able to slam any of the songs. There's not a single Tom Petty song that I think, I hate that song. There's not really one that I skip. There's some stuff that I love, and there's some stuff that that's okay. That's a sort of an average Tom Petty song. Now, an average Tom Petty song is still better than most other artists' greatest hits. Right. But so this one for me sort of lands in that place where it's sort of, yeah, it's good, but I think it's just sort of not a placeholder. That's not the right word, but it's giving a little bit of space because there's something like Don't Do Me Like That. What Are You Doing in My Life is on side 2. If you put all those on side 1, then you'd have less left for side 2. So I think that might have played into that decision making. I don't know if you.
Yeah, I mean, you look at side 2, how it starts with "Don't Do Me Like That," which is an old much. We don't need to talk too much about it right now, but you could have put that fourth.
Yeah,
and you're looking at one of the greatest album sides of all time. You are probably still are, but I think this is a classic like album track. Like they knew that it wasn't like going to be a giant hit, but it's a solid track, and they found something that could follow even the Losers and not look terrible.
Yeah, and again, not one that was played live very often. I don't think it was included in any of the compilations really. But then we head into Century City, which of course has a great backstory. Talking about, even the Losers has that backstory. Century City, well, they're going through all this bankruptcy stuff, and they're trying to record this album when they don't really have a deal yet in place. So Century City comes out of that sort of that frustration of dealing with all these suits. What do you think of that song? It's a closer of side 1.
Yeah, and I think that they did that on purpose because I think you're trying to, finish strong to get some, people to turn the record over and listen to side 2. It's not my favorite. I think this would probably be, if there was a track that I needed to cut for another. I mean, I do have a sleeper track that I'd like to add from the B-sides. Yeah. But this is probably the one that's just like, I could take it or leave it. It has a pretty good beat. It's up tempo. It's a kind of a rocker. I think maybe over the last 5 or 10 years, as I watched the documentaries and stuff, it just seems like it came out of a negative place for him. And I kind of sense that when I listen to it now, that he hated going to Century City, dealing with the lawyers. It was like his absolute least favorite thing to do. And so that sort of kind of translated to the song for me a little bit.
No, I totally understand where you're coming from. For me, it's always been one of those that I love the tempo of it so much. And I like the chorus. It's just it's so simple and so sort of brash in a way. Like it's got a bit more of a punky sort of feel to it than anything else on the album. So I kind of like it for that. But as you said, and that's where we get back to our generation. We grew up with vinyl. First song should draw you in. The last song should make you want to jump off the couch, go flip the vinyl, and get straight into side 2. Right? And I think it definitely serves as that anchor for side 2. Yeah. But starting off with side 2, now we get "Don't Do Me Like That." So what do you think? What do you think of this one?
This is one of my favorite of his of all time. I think this is my favorite track on the album. I don't think it's head and shoulders above, for me, "Here Comes My Girl," even the Losers, but it's right there with "Here Comes My Girl" at 1, 2 for me. It just is a really well put together track. The organ is great. The lyrics are great. The beat's great. Just a phenomenal song. And I think it was really interesting that this was a Mudcrutch tune that he sort of passed on for his first 2 albums. Like they had this available to him and he didn't want to record it. And then Jimmy went back and listened to, I think, everything that they had prior to, starting to record this album. And he dusted off a couple from the Mudcrutch days. And this was one of them. And what a song to dust off. Now this is their second biggest hit, top 10 hit, their first top 10 hit. The only other top 10 hit that they had on their main Billboard charts was, or it was actually just a solo hit, was "Free Fallin'." And this is one that wouldn't always get played. So this is in concert. So this is always one that I wanted to hear. And I think this is part of the reason maybe I'm a little not over Refugee, but not seeking to hear it out all the time, is because I always wanted to hear "Don't Do Me Like That" in concert. And he played it probably 75% of the time, 60% of the time. So it was one of those that you had to roll the dice and hope you got one where he played this.
Yeah, and you talk about the composition of it. I think that to me, I could make a very strong argument musically for this being the best song on the album, just because. And again, there's little things like, where Benmont's playing that just din 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 din, and he stays on that minor chord through the rest of the chord progression. Little things like that, that's pulling a trick from the Beatles, right? Where "Love, Love Me Do," the harmony is one line, so you pull in all those little elements in, and then you get these beautiful sort of organ sweeps. It just sounds so big and full and glorious that you can't help but get drawn in by that song.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed listening to your breakdown of this song. I listened.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I listened to your pod, and then I went back to listen to the song again, and I noticed a lot of these things that I didn't notice the first time or the first 1,000 times I've listened to the song. So there's one reason this podcast is so great.
And it's just you're sitting listening, and sometimes like okay, what's it? Oh, because then you get just the one channel, because they were brilliant out there, right? I mean, they were brilliant at sort of stereo mixing and making sure that things are in positions where you can sort of really hear them distinctly, especially the guitars, making sure that Mike and Tom's guitars are mixed into the different channels. And then again, I don't know about you, but I think that Jimmy Iovine really recognized that Benmont was a massive part of the live sound of the Heartbreakers, where he was really mixed very, very low on those first two records. He was sort of pushed out to the periphery, where Damn the Torpedoes, especially his Hammond, his organ sound. I mean, this song is all about that organ. There's really not much going on with the guitars. It's all driven. That melody's all driven by that organ, right?
Yeah, it has a little bit of an R&B feel, and it's a different vocal for Tom. And I think on this album he showed his range and all the different things that he could do, and that's just one of the great things about his vocals.
When I keep saying to anyone who listens, probably, I mean, everyone says, everyone knows that he's recognized as one of the greatest songwriters of all time, but to me, easily one of the best rock and roll vocalists. I mean, okay, you talk about, Plant and Freddie Mercury and Dio and these guys, but they're a different animal. They're sort of belters, and they're doing the same thing most of the time. Petty could phrase things totally different, so it didn't even sound like the same singer sometimes. I think about US 41 from Mojo. If you threw that on and then you threw on, Don't Do Me Like That or Here Comes My Girl, people wouldn't think that's the same singer, I don't think.
Yeah, and not only that, or not only the breadth of his ability to sing different ways, and it was just also his personality. I think you talk about a lot of frontmen, and they didn't have his sense of humor. The crowd ate it up whenever he was talking in between songs. He had something funny to say, and I think the personality really shined through in his lyrics. I mean, and his vocal performance. You don't get that with everybody. Like that's a pretty rare talent. On top of that, being such a great songwriter.
Yeah. So obviously, having seen him live so often, was he a talker? Like, was it sort of 2 or 3 songs, then we'll have a little bit of a story, or was it sort of was his balance of that?
There's a few full concerts available on YouTube. He would typically pare it down and wouldn't talk as much for those performances, but he would certainly, if you go back to the live breakdown on Pack Up the Plantation, that opening where the audience sings like the first portion of the song, which I just love because he just let him do it, and then he chimes in, he goes, "You're gonna put me out of a job," and everybody's like, it's a one-off, nothing that he's planning, but it's just for him to come up. He's a very witty guy, obviously a great writer, great turn of phrase, and it was hilarious. He wasn't cracking jokes like, a stand-up comedian, but he would always have something witty, wry to say, and when he spoke, people paid attention because he didn't sit there and pontificate at the mic very often.
Well, that's what makes this show special, right? I mean, the songs, like you said, I mean, you're going to hear maybe 50%-ish of the same songs each time you go. So those little moments where something different happens, where it's unplanned, those are things that stick with you, and they're those things that you remember. That's why, again, going back to Foo Fighters have always been one of my favorite live acts, because Dave Grohl's he's insane, he's crazy on stage. And he doesn't have the same patter. I saw Van Halen, and you could tell that all the stuff was the same thing they said in every single arena. It gets a bit fake and false. You think, just play the songs if you're going to do that, because I don't really need to listen to Pablum. But if Tom was one of those who was a raconteur as well as sort of a bit of a wit, that just makes it all the better, right? And I think people do, like you said, people feed off that. So
yeah, he was sort of commenting on something that would happen in that particular show too. So something, whatever it would be, but maybe Mike Stan fell over or something strange that
Yeah.
you wouldn't be planned. That's what kind of made it sort of unique to each show.
So did you see him live with Stan, or was Steve already in place by the time you got to see him live the first time?
My first tour, it probably was with probably was still with Stan. That was the Full Moon Fever. No, it was the Into the Great Wide Open tour where they had a giant tree on stage.
Yeah, that would have been.
So I think at that
Stan.
point he still would have been playing drums. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Next track. You tell me. Very different song.
Yeah, and this is, I really dug into the second half of this album in preparation for this podcast. So I listened to this album like a bunch of times so I was speak intelligently about it. You tell me like something that if I hadn't been coming on this podcast, I would be like, what song is this again? But having listened to it a few times, these are the earworms that he is able to put on the second sides of albums. And this is a nice mid-tempo type rocker. I enjoy it. Certainly one I would keep. Just pretty nice little tune. And
it's got a swagger to it. It's got that funk swagger to it. And again, you bring in Duck Dunn on bass, and you're getting a different sound because Ron Blair plays very differently to Duck Dunn. I don't think that Ron Blair would have played. I shouldn't say couldn't have played it, but he definitely wouldn't have played it the same way. And I think you would have lost some of that. Again, it's just got that sort of groove to it. Again, you talked earlier about R&B. This one's definitely got an R&B feel to it, right? Like it's got that real sort of slow, loose, and again, like a real sort of drawled vocal, which we talk about what he could do. He can belt, he can sit in that high range, or he's going to sit and drawl and really lay on the southern accent a little bit thicker, which I think he does a little bit more in this song, right? So, and it wasn't one I was super familiar with either. Again, going back and doing the heavy listen, it's one of those, I remember this track now. Okay, I remember which one this is, but don't know it very well. And then you think, actually, I still quite like it.
I this is one where I added it to a couple playlists because I liked it. And once I listened to it 5 or 6 times in a row or whatever, I added it. Like something about his album tracks that if you listen to them enough, you end up liking them.
Absolutely. So again, talk about album tracks and deep cuts. I think What Are You Doing in My Life, the penultimate track from side 2, might be my favorite deep cut from the first 5 albums, let's say, because it's just so much freaking fun, man. I don't know what are your thoughts on it?
I like it. It's a banger. It's up tempo. It's a rocker. I think he talked about dusting it off and playing it for a benefit. Never really played it live prior to that. And he's like, wow, this really does hold up, and the crowd enjoyed it, so they must have heard it on the album and liked it as well. But the story behind this is just kind of a vague story about a groupie that he was dealing with in New York or something, and just kind of annoying person that would girls following him around and trying to insert herself into his life. So it's a little bit of a negative connotation to it, but it's certainly an interesting track and an up tempo, and it keeps the album moving into Louisiana Rain.
Well, I'm trying to remember what's that. There's a couple of lines in it that I just absolutely love. I'm trying to look through. Yeah, that some friend of a friend of a friend of mine. That repeat, as a songwriter, usually you wouldn't want to do that because you're sort of using the same word over and over. But it works so well. And then there's what's the other one? There was another line that I love. I can't remember what it is. Anyways,
you're putting my name all around in the street, honey. Where did you think this was going to lead?
Yeah,
maybe would you tell me what you want from me?
Yeah, well, they go, well, you're the last woman in the world that thrills me. Now you got my girlfriend trying to kill me. So, like I said, there's that sense of humor, right? There's that sort of little cheeky twinkle in the eye that says, we can have a little bit of fun with this too. And I always think that rock and roll should have a little bit of that, and sometimes some bands lose that. So, like a band like Metallica or Slipknot, I don't know that's a different animal. But even bands like Iron Maiden they'll do something that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek and a little bit silly at times. And I think having that looseness and having that sort of sense of humor, I like that in a rock and roll band. When I go to a rock and roll concert, I want it to be fun.
Yeah. He's not one that took himself too seriously either. No. He would make jokes and stuff, but he didn't he's also pretty humble. So yeah, he was able to take shots at himself a little bit as well.
Well, I love that saying, take what you do very seriously, never take yourself seriously. I think that's a good way to get through your life, I think.
It is.
So leading into the last track, Louisiana Rain.
Yeah, I listened to your episode last night about this, and I remember listening to this the last few times, and I was just really put off by that opening 45, 50 seconds. And it doesn't fit within the context of the album really. I can see Benmont putting out an album of this stuff, and it would be amazing if it was just it was all sort of futuristic keyboard stuff. It's really strange to have this here, and then it kind of takes away from the song. I think Louisiana Rain, if you'd just gone right into it, it would have been a better sequence between these two tracks, but maybe they were trying to segue somehow or give Benmont a minute to do something weird. But the track itself, Louisiana Rain, I think is a really solid closer. I love when bands close albums with slower, more pensive songs that sort of kind of bring you down at the end of the album, maybe lead into their next project or whatever. And this certainly qualifies. I think the lyrics are really vivid and paint a picture. And he's talking about California, he's talking about Louisiana, he's talking about South Carolina. So it's kind of a troubadour type story going along with it, and it's really well done. And this is one I grew to appreciate more as I listened to the album more and more, preparation for this podcast.
I like that comment. It's got that troubadour feel to it. It's that wandering sort of vagrant traveling musician type thing. Steve Earle made a career out of that, right? I mean, he wrote so many songs that had that sort of feel, especially about the South. And I like that idea. There's the imagery of Louisiana Rain. It's got that really sort of, I kind of want to go to Louisiana and stand in the rain just because it seems like there might be something in that. It's a weird, I'm not a particularly spiritual person, but it's got that sort of, that connection with nature is in there as well. But again, I totally agree. And I commented in the episode, that intro just, it almost derails the whole thing. If Louisiana Rain wasn't such a great song, that would be one where you'd say, I'm going to skip that because I just can't get through this first minute. And I edited it out on because I have it on my phone to listen to in my playlist. I just cut that off because it's like, I don't mind listening to it on its own. And if it was sort of, maybe it is a hidden track even at the end, leave a minute's gap after Louisiana Rain and then put it on. But to put it at the beginning, it's so weird. It's so out of place with everything else. I just don't get it at all.
Yeah, and it's kind of a country song, and I think Tom, huge. In maybe in another universe, the Heartbreakers break up or something, and he pivots to country because he could have been a phenomenal country artist, or at least put together a phenomenal country album. But definitely you can hear the Southern roots in this one. And you commented about the lyrics about the Sailor Boys. I think what he was talking about there, he was talking about San Diego. And there's a naval base there. And I think maybe there was a girl or something, and she was dating some of the sailors, or he wanted to date her or something. That's my guess. That's what I took from it, as opposed to more of something about the rain.
Okay, interesting. That's neat. Yeah, I didn't pick up on that. I'll go back and re-listen myself and see if I can get that connection as well. Yeah. And it's, like you said, in terms of how you close an album, again, I would say it's not to bring you down necessarily, but to release. Again, and I think that's what Tom did so brilliantly in a lot of songs is that build of tension and then release of tension. You have to have that. It's the same thing that comedians do, right? They'll get you really, really tight, and then the joke, the laugh, the ha-ha, that's the bit where you, okay, good. And that's what Louisiana Rain does for me after the sort of the frenetic nature, especially of what are you doing in my life. Now we just sort of end on a nice, mellow, subtle note.
And that's the dichotomy between closing an album and closing a concert.
Yes.
Sometimes he would close a concert with, Learning to Fly acoustic, or All Right for Now or something. And it was occasional. Yeah. He would just play solo acoustic and sort of close the concert that way. But 99 times out of 100, he was, finishing with Refugee or American Girl or something, and just leaving on that absolute high.
Yeah.
But the difference here is that he wants to leave you in a more pensive mode and bring you down and have that release that you were talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, totally agree. And like I said, with the concert, I pretty much always want to leave on a high. Yeah. I think one of the best closes I've ever seen was when Alice Cooper, I took my youngest daughter to Alice Cooper, and we had second row, dead center, in quite a small arena. Obviously, it was not that long ago, so he's at the end of things. But so we finished with Schools Out and The Wall. So they sort of do Schools Out, and then they segue into The Wall. We Don't Need No Education, and then all the sort of the banners and the streamers and all the confetti and everything comes down. And it's just like, that's how you end a show, man. Same thing, American Girl. I think if you close on American Girl, if that's your closer, man, first of all, you got a great catalog to pull from, and second of all, you're leaving people in the best mood as they're heading home, right? So
basically out of breath.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get. I wanted to ask you, where would you rank Damn the Torpedoes within the Tom Petty catalog? How does it sort of sit for you?
It's definitely I think the best album pre Full Moon Fever.
Okay.
So that puts it up there. I probably would put Wildflowers and Into the Great Wide Open ahead of it. I think even the Wildflowers 2 album that I put together
Yeah.
on Spotify for myself, I think I prefer that to this, but certainly fourth, fifth of his official releases, I think I would put it there. Just, I mean, you can't deny the tracks on here. It's just
Yeah.
I think within the context of my petty fandom, it just took a backseat to some of those other albums later on that I just absolutely loved and got me into him in the first place.
Yeah, and so that's what we were talking about earlier, right? Your relationship with albums from when you get into an artist moving forward, it's just always going to be a little bit different. And I think I would sort of agree with that. I would put it in roughly around about the same sort of spot. And we'll get into the next time we chat. Hopefully, it will be about Hard Promises. And I actually I know I'm in the minority with most Petty fans on this, but I actually think that's the better album of the two. Just because I think with Hard Promises, they took everything they learned on Damn the Torpedoes. He came in with an equally strong set of songs, but they were just even better. The studio music, musicianship was better. The relationship with Iovine was established, so that was a lot easier. And it just feels like that album, again, that's sort of the perfect radio rock album. Takes it even one step further for me. And so then, if it's sort of there at that sort of top end or top third within Petty's catalog, how do you compare it against sort of the all-time great American albums? Blonde on Blonde by Dylan or Born to Run, those types of things.
I think it's, I'm a huge Petty fan, so I put his discography a little higher, and his, he just would finish higher in a lot of the album rankings than maybe the average fan. I think it was a classic 70s, early 80s. It kind of kept rock going, I think, into the 80s when it was sort of fading into some new wave, or maybe there's a lot more of this synthesizer music happening and pop happening, and maybe kind of kept the genre going a little bit into the early 80s. So I think it's a very important album from that standpoint. And obviously the side one and the 4 huge hits for him and just classic rock staples make it a very important album, I think, within the scheme of things.
Yeah. And again, talking about, if you listen to Shelley Yakis and you listen to Iovine and you listen to other people in the industry at that time, it changed the way that rock and roll albums were produced. Like, Stan's drums especially really had a huge impact on what everyone else was doing. Kiss have said like they totally changed their studio recording processes after listening to the album, because, actually you can make drums sound huge but not have them muddy and sort of overwhelm everything else. Like, and that trick of sort of being able to do that and balance everything out perfectly. So sonically, it's just a tremendous achievement. And then, like you said, I mean, so many huge hits off it. And again, his breakout album, if you will. I know that the first album got him recognition, but this is the album that set him on course, right?
Yeah, this vaulted him into superstardom. Yeah. I think you look at what it was compared to his first 2 albums in terms of sales and radio play and all that. This put him on a trajectory that I think he was dreaming of when he came out to California.
Yeah, definitely. So if you had to pick 3 favorites, and again, not necessarily what the best songs are in necessarily, but if your favorite 3, that if you only could have 3 and you had to have a Damn the Torpedoes 3-track playlist, what's going on there?
Yeah, and I think I alluded to this earlier. Refugee actually wouldn't make the 3-song cut, and that's just my own personal preference. I think it's a phenomenal song, but just I don't need to hear it as often as I need to hear number 1, Don't Do Me Like That, number 2, Here Comes My Girl, and number 3, Even the Losers. I think that's a trilogy from this album that would be my EP if I had to try to sell somebody on the album.
Well, you know what? I don't know if this is going to happen very often as we go through these album wrap-ups, but I have exactly the same 3 songs written down. Those are exactly my 3 too. I was thinking, well, do I put a deep cut on there? Because I could put Louisiana Rain or What Are You Doing in My Life, because I love those songs for different reasons. But really, again, I can't do without any of those 3 songs because, and again, I mean, Even the Losers is perfection. And Don't Do Me Like That is, again, I think, arguably the strongest song on the album, and maybe the strongest song from the first, again, 5 or 6. So yeah, excellent. We are in agreement. So we'll create that playlist. I'm going to create that playlist. I'm going to put it out online for people to listen to.
Yeah, I think that if fans can check out the deluxe version that's out, you're going to be treated to some some B-sides, some tracks that were sort of left off. Surrender has been one of my favorites. It's made a few different compilations here and there, and I think they knew it was a good song.
Yeah.
But the story behind it was that they couldn't get it right in the studio. Like they recorded it a bunch of different times, bunch of different sessions for a bunch of different albums, and they could never get it quite right. But every versions I've listened to, I think deserved to be on one of their albums at the time. Like I think it's a great track. So if I, were to replace something, I probably would put Surrender in for Century City. I think that would make the album a little bit better. There is also room for more tracks on this album if they wanted to go to 10, 11, 12 tracks, back with the old vinyl limitations. But Nowhere was a track that when listening to this album, in preparation for this podcast, once again, I started listening to these. Nowhere is not one that I had heard very often, and that's a good track as well. And I know Casadega is a fan favorite. It has 881,000 streams on Spotify, and the most of that second disc, which is interesting. It's sort of a kind of a reggae themed, and I can see why they maybe didn't include it, but it's a fun track. But certainly I think Surrender should have made the album. And if we're playing producer for a day, I couldn't believe that over the course of 3 or 4 albums where it was recorded or tried, that it didn't make one of those albums. It's really a great song.
Well, it's funny, we actually forgot to do that. If there was one track you would change out or you would drop from the album, and again, we're in agreement, that's the one that I would pick, and I had Surrender for Shadow of a Doubt, yeah. So, and I think, again, in terms of sequencing, maybe you would switch out and put something else in. I wouldn't necessarily put that on side 1. I'd maybe drop it onto side 2. Or maybe because you got Louisiana Rain on side 2, which is similar in tempo and similar in sort of just general vibe, that it might not work. But yeah, I'm totally on board with this. I think we're in simpatico here. This is good.
I think the only difference is that I would have replaced Century City. You would replace
you do Century.
Shadow.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
sorry,
That would be the one that just sort of leaves me a little flat. And I know it's for various reasons that I explained earlier. But
yeah,
I mean, I think I'd close it. I think I'd close side 1 with it, because I think that's strong of a track. I think it leads pretty well into Don't Do Me Like That as well.
Well, I think I smell another playlist coming on. Maybe we'll have to put a playlist together, and I'll have to listen through and see what it sounds like.
I've already made it.
Well, then you'll have to share it with me, and I will share it with my listeners and see what they think. Although I think we might get in a little bit of trouble with this, because I think, rearranging track lists and taking tracks off can be a little bit. You can get into a little bit of hot water with the rabid.
Certainly with the fans.
Community. Yes.
Well, do you want to hear the time that I touched Tom Petty's boot?
I would love to hear that.
Okay, it's a fairly quick story. But I was living in Memphis at the time. It was 1999. I had tickets to see Tom play in Memphis, and then the following night in Nashville. And he was always really good about getting tickets, like good tickets, into the hands of his fans. And he was one of the first that I remember that had the $50 fan club, and you get the pre-sale, and I ended up with 16th row seats to see him in Memphis. And I took a girl I was dating at the time, just brand new relationship, a flight attendant, and she was a little kooky. She wasn't like the biggest Tom Petty fan, but I was like trying to see if, did she have good musical taste, etc. And somewhere like midway through the main set, she leaves to go to the bathroom and, get a beer or whatever. And she's gone for like a long time, like 3 or 4 songs. I'm starting to get kind of annoyed. I'm like, this is Tom Petty. Like, why are you not back? And she comes back, and I'm like a little bit, okay, where were you? What's going on? And she said, well, I ran into this couple as they were leaving, and they gave me tickets to their seats in the front row. Do you want to go? And I'm like, yeah, I want to go. So I went up from the 16th row, went up the side, and it was the 2 seats that she got were like the last 2 seats in the section way off to the side. Yeah. And it was still front row, so we're still a little bit closer than the 16th row. And maybe a song goes by, and this is back in the day when fans were sort of up on this, like still leaning on the stage. There was like a lower level to the stage and then a higher level to the stage. There was no bar or security in between the stage and the front row. So I noticed that there was a couple that, we're getting towards the end of the main set, probably have 3 or 4, more songs, and a couple like leaves dead center their spots on the stage, and like just like leaves the row, like they're leaving the show. And so I was like, let's go. So I ran over there, came in. So there's some room behind me because there's the row of seats. And so we're just leaning on the stage and literally looking up at Tom. He's 3 feet away.
Oh my
and
God.
he's playing the closing tracks to his main set, and one of them was Free Fallin', and I saw he was sitting there playing it, one of my favorite songs by him, and I saw the guy next to me put his hands out like in a little cup shape, and I didn't know what that was all about, and I figured it out that he was asking Tom to like drop a pick. I didn't, I haven't been in the front row that often to experience that. So I did that as well. And then Tom finishes Free Fallin', drops the pick, and with my cat-like reflexes, I put my hand on the pick and I pull it in, and I have it here. It's
no way.
It says, I don't know if you can see that. It says Rock Lives on it. So that's the pick that Tom Petty played Free Fallin' with. And then as the concert goes on, they go off for their encore, come back on, is playing American Girl. And like he steps down as this is all happening. And so he's literally like, I could reach out and touch him, like touch his boot.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do something because it was the only chance I was going to ever get a chance to, like, I don't know. He's like a rock god to me. Right. So I just reached out and I made my hand into a fist and I just tapped his suede boot 3 times. And I'm like, wait a second, what am I doing? Like, I could get kicked out for this, right?
Yes.
And so I look up and he's looking straight down at me with a big toothy grin. Like, look at this lunatic 6'8" fan. But I mean, I wasn't like grabbing his, like doing anything. Like, I just tapped his foot 3 times. And then I looked up and he was looking straight at me. And I was like, oh my God, I'm never going to forget this. And then the show ended and that was the end of it. And that was like that's my Tom Petty brush with fame story. Like that was an incredible moment there in Memphis.
I think that's one of those nights though that probably it's one of the ones that he would remember, because it's not like, because you can, people grabbing at you, you're going to get that for sure, and you're going to get but someone randomly tapping your foot 3 times, that's a bit. Is this a signal? Am I getting
Tom Petty's right here, I was like, oh, and I was just like, just gently. I was like, oh my God, Tom Petty's boot, I got to touch it.
Well, I mean, you got to take your opportunities when they come, right? And you wouldn't do it on the first song because you wouldn't get kicked out on the first song, but
I felt like if I got kicked out, it'd be the last 25-30 seconds. It was probably worth it.
So 6'8", you said?
Yeah, 6'8". So that's
probably an impression.
Yeah, he might remember me. I think he looked at me the next night in Nashville going, oh, that's the same lunatic from the previous.
Yeah, security.
We were in the second row in that show. So that was a pretty good weekend there.
I did want to talk quickly about, because you mentioned it earlier, Wildflowers 2, the playlist that you put together and you kindly sent to me. So just tell my listeners a little bit about that, and I'm going to put a link to that in the episode notes too for you.
Oh, thank you. It was just a kind of a little project that I had when the Wildflowers and All the Rest came out. There was also a few stray Wildflowers songs that made some other releases that he had. And I kind of wanted to put all the Wildflowers 2 stuff, like the leftovers, into one playlist, and then also sequence it in a way that I thought he might sequence it. Really paying special attention to the tempo, acoustic versus rock, etc. And I think I did put together one that, and I'd love listening to it. I probably listened to this album 50 to 100 times already. And it takes some of the tracks, which from the She's the One soundtrack, which I think was kind of criminally underrated. But it was not a normal like album release for them. They didn't tour really to support it. He got involved in that project and thought that he would be able to, enlist his friends and musicians to sort of record all the song. He ended up having to do it all himself. So he took some of the Wildflowers tracks, and California is like one of my favorite songs of his of all time. So that sort of anchors the side one. And it's 15 tracks. It's almost exact same length as Wildflowers 1. And I think it flows really well. There's bangers, there's acoustic songs, there's everything on it. And I appreciate you listening to it and tweeting it out earlier and putting it in the show notes, because I think it's a fun way to listen to this group of songs. They weren't all put together on that, all the rest. Like Driving Down to Georgia wasn't on there. Girl on LSD wasn't necessarily on there. Lonesome Dave was a Wildflower track or a leftover Wildflowers track that didn't make all the rest. And then You Saw Me Coming, ended up on a different sort of Wildflowers release. So having them all together in sort of a sequential playlist that works is a lot of fun for me to put together.
And I would say to my listeners, definitely check that out. Like I said, I'll put this in the episode notes and I'll put a link online this week on social media. When you listen to Wildflowers and you do sort of get into that, this is the flow of how these songs should go. I definitely completely fell in love with that playlist that you put together because you're right. It's got the same feel of control of pacing. Let's put it that way, right? We sort of, you're not building too much, you're not front loading all the strongest songs out of that group of songs, because Wildflowers doesn't do that either. You know, Change Your Mind is like the closer from Wildflowers again is just a tremendous song, and it's left till 15th place on an album. You know, let's forget about 10th for American Girl. That song coming at 15th. So I think you did a great job of balancing that out. So again, I'll leave that in the episode notes, and I'll let people comment on that, and hopefully we can get some people listening to it. And maybe one day, you never know, maybe we'd have a second vinyl release. We can get the estate on board.
I was thinking about putting it. I don't really listen to vinyl, but I was thinking about getting a vinyl made of this just to have it.
Yeah.
It'd be fun. That's the kind of nerd I am.
Oh, totally. And I mean, you could get that done for, well, you'd need a double.
$100 maybe.
It's about $100, yeah. Well, come to Canada. Go buy from Canada. It's a little bit cheaper up here. Our dollar's not quite as strong. Okay, so that's all for this week, folks. I hope you enjoyed our recap, and the plan is that we're going to do this for each of the albums moving forward, or as many as John can do, given his hectic schedule. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook and Instagram at The Tom Petty Project, and on Twitter at Tom Petty Project. You can, of course, find me on YouTube. So go follow, like, subscribe as applicable. And again, please leave a rating or a review if you haven't done that already. They do help. Again, my project isn't affiliated with the Tom Petty Estate in any way. If you're looking for Tom's music, please visit all the official channels and go to the YouTube channel first. And please visit tompetty.com for official merchandise. Don't forget to check out Tom Petty Nation and Tom Petty Fans Forever groups on Facebook if you're not already a member of those groups, as they're excellent communities and they're well worth checking out. And I'm going to throw it over quickly to John so that he can let you know where you can find his football site and his podcast. Because again, if you're into those things, you should definitely give them a listen because they're very well rated.
Yeah, if you're interested in fantasy football at all, check out our site, 4for4.com. It's the number 4, FOR, the number 4.com. And my Twitter handle is 4for4 _ John, JOHN. So I've got a few followers over there if you're interested in my fantasy takes. We got the NFL draft coming up, or it probably will be done by the time this episode posts, but it's a busy time. Then I'll have some time off, and then back at it in July and August.
Right on, man. Okay, so until we meet again, keep listening to and sharing Tom's music. Try to be kind. Try to say I love you to someone at least once a day. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll be back with you. And John and I will be back with you later. I'll be back with you next week to talk about the first track from Hard Promises, The Waiting. Bye-bye.